Excellent. So welcome to Dr. Peter Turnbaugh. Comes from the University of California, San Francisco, where he researches the metabolic activities performed by the trillions of microbes that colonize human adult bodies. Um, as a highly respected researcher, Dr. Turnbaugh, or as he prefers, Peter, has over 150 publications and approximately 100,000 citations. Previously, he's spoken at our BioRender Visualize event last fall, which we were very honored to have him speak at. But we can't get enough of his wisdom, especially as he is currently grant reviewing as a member of the NMHD study section. And I'm sorry about my audio if it's a bit laggy. Hopefully it's caught up there. I'll give it a second to catch up. All right. We are very privileged to have Dr. Turnbaugh back and have him today to share his grant reviewing insights on the right way to approach NIH grants. So I'll hand it over and give him a warm round of applause.
Okay, thanks so much, Shiz. It's really a pleasure to be back again. We're addicted to the t-shirts in our lab, so thank you for having us. And yeah, I was very inspired by the last talk. I think I'm going to show you a couple examples of figures later in this talk from our lab, and I think it'll really give you a sense for, how you really don't have to get this stuff perfect. Not everyone can make sort of the level of quality figures that Daniel showed us, but just trying your hardest can really make a big difference in your grants. And so a couple years ago, my older daughter Hazel drew this diagram, and I think it really highlights what my job is. So what she said: when my dad is at work, he has grants to write. Sometimes he does not write grants. And that's really true. I view grant writing as really my number one goal, to try to keep the lab well funded and sustainable. And as you all know, this process is really, really hard. So you have to sort of get thick skin and really get used to a lot of rejection. These are a couple of quotes from my grants. So the first one, he's clearly very smart, but hasn't been intellectually challenged yet. And then the second one: it seems naive to me to suggest that there's a whole wealth of usable insight to be gained from culture of individual microorganisms. So as Shiz mentioned, we work on the gut microbiome, and so the second one really, puts a dagger through one of our main methods that we use in the lab. And then the first one obviously really takes me down a peg in terms of my brain. And the other thing that is sort of mysterious and hard to predict is sort of how your grant is going to get received by reviewers. And so this is an example of my own attempt, unsuccessfully, to get the New Innovator Award. The first time I wrote it was in 2012. And for those of you that don't know, NIH grants are scored between 10 and 90, where 10 is a perfect score. And so the first time I got a 34, I was thinking, oh, this is really great. Tried again 2 years later with an even more polished, I thought more exciting grant. My score went down to a 55. And then the third time, it wasn't even discussed at all, so I didn't even get a score. So that shows you that even though you think the grant's getting better, your reviewers may not agree. And so you've probably all heard this quote from Malcolm Gladwell about 10,000 hours. So that translates to about sort of working 4 hours a day on something for 10 years. Hopefully with the advice you just got from Daniel and what I'm going to share with you, you can get there a little faster. But I think you should rest assured that grant writing is a skill, and it just requires a lot of practice to get better at it. And we've all gone through that painful process. And importantly, even though when you start out in science, you don't necessarily think of yourself as a writer, it's really important. You really have to become a writer to lead a research lab. And to do that, you just need to write all the time. So, both reading and writing are really should be sort of a routine every day. Okay, so just to walk you through a few basic do's and don'ts. And I think we got some of those from the previous talk as well. So this is something that really took me a while to sink in, but your goal as a grant writer is really to explain what you're working on, not to try to impress people with how great you are. You want to keep your writing simple, try to use as few words as possible, keep your paragraphs short, and add lots of white space to sort of make the grant easier to read and more pleasing to the eye. And another thing that any English major would know, but a lot of us scientists hadn't heard about, is topic sentences. And so, every paragraph should start with a topic sentence. Your reader should be able to skip the rest of every paragraph and still understand the grant just by reading the first sentence. So things that you should not do, as I mentioned, don't try to just blow people away with how great you are. You need that to come out organically from the grant, not by sort of being fancy or making things hard to understand. Really try to avoid jargon or unnecessary abbreviations. These things, make it harder to read, and they make the reviewer think they're dumb. Don't write run-on sentences, and avoid like parentheses and asides, which can really make writing hard to interpret. And so this next slide might seem sort of esoteric, but the words that we use really do matter a lot. And so there's a few, these are examples of a few words that are really amazing for describing science. So words like examine, evaluate, determine, test, very active, sort of strong words. Here's some examples of okay words. So define, maybe not as good as examine, but it's still a good one. Delineate, assess. And then there is a long list, I think, that we all could put together of words that you should really not use in your grant. And so really common ones are characterize and describe. These are what we think of as waffle words. They just sound sort of weak, like you don't know what you're doing, you don't have a goal. And then this next category, analyze, dissect, identify, quantify, these are great words, but they have a very specific meaning in science. And so, for example, dissect is how we sort of take apart an organism and look at the different parts. And so you want to make sure you're using those words in the right context and not in others. Believe, scientists really search for truth. We're not trying to establish a belief system, and so try to avoid that. And then words like novel and innovative, it might seem like good ideas to put in, but you really want to let the reader decide what's new and interesting. Don't sort of force feed them that. And then each scientific field has a lot of words that sort of make reviewers angry. And so in the microbiome field, these are words like dysbiosis and flora. So anytime I read a grant with those words, it just sort of puts me on edge right away. And so I'm not going to read through this next slide. Hopefully you guys can get access to the talk later. But these are just a list of 10 writing tips, sort of why each of them matters, why we have a hard time with them, and what you can do to fix them. And so another thing to keep in mind is that you really want to adjust your style to the type of grant you're writing. And so the last talk really focused on cats, which is maybe a little bit more like a foundation grant. These typically are sort of big picture essay style grants. You want to avoid putting too much detail, so no preliminary data, or maybe a little bit of preliminary data. And really one of the main things that you're trying to get across is why are you special? What is your unique skill set? Why is your question important? And here you really want to know your audience. So some of these foundation awards are things like the Searle Scholars Program, where they're really looking at broad areas of biology, and your grant will not be reviewed by an expert in the field that you're working on. And others, like the one we have from the Parkinson's Foundation, are really focused on one specific disease area. And so you want to sort of think about who's going to read your grant and what they might expect in terms of how you write it. And then I'll just touch on a couple of the NIH common mechanisms. So R21s are sort of shorter term grants from NIH. They only require 6 pages of research plan. And you really do need preliminary data. So, even though technically the RFA says you don't, reviewers really expect to see it there. And they require a lot less detail than an R01, but you still really need to sort of write them like you would for NIH. So you need to learn that NIH style. And as Daniel mentioned, you really want to know your study section. So, what type of people are going to read your grant? And I would encourage you to email people at your institution that are on that study section and sort of ask them what they look for and what other people look for in grant proposals. So the R01, this is really the bread and butter for biomedical research. It's a 12-page long proposal, so it's twice the length of an R21. You need a lot of preliminary data and you need a lot of detail, but you need to sort of try not to overwhelm reviewers and make it easy to digest. And it's really important that you spend a lot of time sort of talking through your controls, sort of why your approach is the right one to take, and what the alternatives might be. And so I'll just walk you through a few of the main sections of these NIH grants and with a few key tricks. Most grants have an abstract, and scientists really, most of us expect to see a specific a logical series in abstracts. And so I think it's really important that you don't try to get creative and sort of stick to the formula. And we should be good at that because we're scientists. And so, for an NIH grant, this typically is, blank is an important disease, but we know very little about some aspect of that disease. So that's the knowledge gap. My goal is determine how something does something. And then, based on the following, we came up with this hypothesis about how this might work. And we're going to use the following approaches to study it. And then typically about half of the page or half of the abstract sort of briefly summarizes the aims. And then you want to end with 2 to 3 sentences about why this will be really important, not just for the specific area of study you're working on, but for the broader area of science. And so next up is specific aims. This I would consider the most important part of any NIH grant. You should spend the vast majority of your time working on that one page. And I think it's really important to start this process early. You want to find a couple friends that can really give you critical feedback on that page and really iterate, revise, repeat, send it out again. Try to sort of hone that page until you really feel like it's perfect. And importantly, I think you should, really try to lock your aims before you start the research plan. And so, my goal when I write grants is that I really only want to write the research plan once. So it's 12 pages long. You don't want to get in a cycle of rewriting 12 pages. A bunch of times you'll spend the rest of your life writing that grant. And so that means that you really should not be changing your aims after you move from the aims page to the research plan. And also, just as an aside, you want to avoid dependencies between aims. So make sure that each aim could be done in parallel, that they don't require one of the other aims to be completed first. It's good to put your hypothesis in bold. And I would also just caution you to limit the use of bold in other sentences. So, bolding and italics and underlines can be really distracting, and they sort of rob the reader of the ability to choose what words they think are important. Remember to have lots of white space and use figures are really important. And so the research plan really has 3 main sections. I'll just share a few key pieces of advice for each one. So for significance, really the point of this is to provide essential background information. So you don't need to review the entire field, but you do need to tell the reader all the information they would need to understand your aims. You want to avoid the use of sort of death stats. So it's really not important how many people die a given year from your disease. It's really more important what the project that you're proposing will teach you about that disease. You don't want to load down the grant too much with these numbers. And really avoid overstatements. And a common thing in NIH grants is that people promise new drugs or other products, and you need to acknowledge the realistic view that that might take many decades to achieve and won't happen within the context of a single grant. And then the main point of the significance section is to really focus on knowledge gaps and the conceptual importance of what you're working on. In terms of the next section, innovation, you want to explain both conceptually what's unique about your approach and also methodologically what types of new methods are you using that other people have not used in the past. And this is a good section to talk about, if it's relevant, the interdisciplinary nature of your research. And it's also okay for innovation to be relatively brief. So this doesn't have to be, more than half a page or maybe a 3/4 of a page. And then really the bulk of the grant is spent on approach. So here for NIH, feasibility is really the king. So you want to really convince the reader that you have the right expertise and this is definitely going to work. So you've probably heard of this rigor of prior research. Yeah, it's important to really emphasize what we know based on the literature. You're really on firm ground based on what people have done in the past. And then also provide your own preliminary data supporting your aims. And it's important to avoid sort of data dumps. So just sort of choose the data that really supports your hypothesis or addresses your hypothesis one way or another. Don't just show them all the data that you've generated in your lab. And here it's okay, if there's problems or challenges that you're gonna face. You just want to be upfront about this and talk about the caveats of your approach, talk about its limitations, and then talk about alternative hypotheses. So really what the reviewers are looking for is that you're sort of realistic about your own limitations and that you have ideas for how you might address those limitations. So as we heard from Daniel, BioRender and other tools are great for really improving the graphics in your grants. And I do think this matters a lot. This is just a couple examples from our lab. So this was an F32 postdoc fellowship application from Cecilia Naker, which was scored a 15 out of 90. And the grant really walks through sort of a very focused analysis of the metabolism of one particular gut bacterium named Agarthella lenta in AIM-1. And then she zooms out to look at interactions with other microbes in AIM-2. And then in AIM-3, sort of analyzing that at the population scale, looking at different humans. And so I thought that really conceptualized the overall goal of the grant really nicely. And then another example is from Thang Kia. He's an MD PhD student in the lab and got one of our only perfect scores on a grant. This is a little bit more complicated, but sort of walks through all the various ways that bacteria may potentially be affecting an efflux transporter called P-glycoprotein, and sort of walking through the different stages of PGP expression and activity, and then its degradation. And so to recap, grant writing just requires a lot of practice. So you should learn to enjoy writing and do it as much as you can. Really focus on clarity, and my graduate advisor always talked about the lazy reader. So you want to make the reading process as easy as possible for whoever's reading it. And remember that you're a teacher. You're not trying to impress people. And fortunately for me, you don't have to use all sorts of fancy language like Faulkner. You're just trying to keep things really simple and focused on the science. And try as a rule of thumb to put one simple and pretty graphic on every page. And so with that, I want to thank the lab, and I'm happy to take any questions now or in the Q&A later.